Our survey collects valuable feedback that helps ensure we can continue to provide the same quality programs moving forward. We would appreciate you taking just a couple of minutes to complete that survey. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Matt, who's going to talk to us about fall lawn care.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me today. I'm excited to talk about fall lawn care, and I hope you are excited to learn about fall lawn care. We were joking earlier that typically fall or lawn care in general is not one of the reasons we get out of bed in the morning and get excited about gardening, but there is a lot of great things that we can learn when it comes to taking care of our lawns and really putting in the smart work now so that our lawn looks the best all year long. And really today, the number one goal that we're going to look at is answering the long time question of why does the grass always look greener on the other side of the fence? So today, the goal is for you at the end of this to be able to have the greenest grass in the neighborhood because of what you learned today. And it's not going to be the greenest grass in the neighborhood because it's fake, because, you know, sometimes that happens and you'll see astroturf in people's lawns, but that's not why we want to have the greenest grass in the neighborhood. And I think the big question about today is why care at all about fall lawn care? A lot of people have more important things in their yard that they grow. People love their trees, they love their shrubs, they love the flowers, but not always loving their lawns. And I think sometimes lawns really get a bad rap because when you think about lawns, oftentimes you hear all kinds of negative things out there. You hear lawns are bad for the earth, or I love my family and the environment more than I love my lawn. Well, guess what? I do too. And there's nothing wrong with loving both though, because lawns do so many positive things for us and the environment too. A lot of people don't recognize some of the benefits of turf grass. So I want to spend just a few minutes before we get too deep into it, talking about some of the reasons why we should care about fall lawn care. Lawns are a great way to reduce noise. As much as 40% of traffic volume is reduced by having a lawn in front of your house versus hard surfaces like your driveways or sidewalks. Lawns also help reduce glare and increase visibility on sunny days. And lawns are a great natural air conditioning. Lawns are typically always 30% cooler than our asphalt surfaces, and even 14% cooler than bare ground. So when you think about large grassy areas like some of our grasslands in Kansas, typically those areas of lawn, maybe native lawn, are going to be 10 to 15% cooler than our urban landscapes are going to be. Lawns are also a great way to help reduce pollution. Lawns create thatch, and that thatch is a great way to bind things like oils and grease and chemicals and eliminates those products from reaching our water supplies because those products get caught in the thatch layer of our lawns and grasses, and that holds them there for the microbes to be able to break them down and basically purify our water as it goes back into the grounds and into waterways and rivers, streams. Lawns are also going to be a great way to help reduce air pollution. As much as 12 million tons of dust are kicked up into the atmosphere every single year in the United States alone. And it's really our grasses on our lawns that are going to trap most of that airborne dust. One of my favorite fun facts about lawns is the amount of oxygen that each lawn produces. We usually think about trees providing cooling and providing oxygens, but our lawns do it too. And all it really takes is a 2,500 square foot of lawn to absorb enough carbon dioxide every single year to produce oxygen for a family of 4. So that's just a 50 foot by 50 foot section of lawn is enough lawn each year to produce oxygen for a family of 4. Most people, though, have far more lawn than that. So a quarter acre of lawn, if you live on a quarter acre property, you produce oxygen for 17 people every single year because of your lawns. That's pretty cool. Lawns are also a great way to establish and increase the value of our homes. A well-manicured lawn increases your home values by as much as 15%, which is a really big deal when you start to talk about prices of homes. So I won't bore you to death on all of the benefits of lawns because there are many. And so there's many reasons for us to be here today and to care about our lawns. But with our lawns, we often have many different ways where we can struggle. I think one of the biggest things we'll talk about first is poorly adapted lawns, things that we try to pour our heart into that to get our lawns to grow well, but they don't always work. But then there's always insects and diseases and fertilization and weeds and all these extremes and problems that we could experience today. So these will be the types of things that we hope to address in our hour with you today. So one of the biggest things that I see people struggling with lawns is using poorly adapted turfgrass varieties. So the first thing we want to do today before we get too deep into lawn care is talking about which type of lawn grass you have. Typically, our lawns are going to be divided into one of two categories, either our warm season lawns or our cool season lawns. Typically, our warm season lawns are going to include grasses like Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, buffalo grass. Those are going to be considered warm season lawns. And essentially, those types of grasses grow best in the summer, are very heat and drought tolerant, and typically go dormant during the winter months. But the lawns that we're really going to focus on right now and in the fall lawn care timeframe is our cool season lawns, lawns like tall fescue lawns or Kentucky bluegrass lawns. Typically, these lawns are going to perform the best in cooler, wetter weather. So they really thrive in the spring and the fall, which is why we want to focus in our care on these lawns right now to really get them as healthy as possible for the rest of the year. Typically, our cool season lawns in a normal situation would go dormant during the summer months. Oftentimes, we don't see tall fescue or Kentucky bluegrass go dormant in the summer months because people are providing additional irrigation, which helps keep those lawns green all year long. But when it comes to the cool season grasses, tall fescue is really where we're going to focus our energy and our time today, because really that's one of the most popular turf grasses that you'll find across the state. We'll also talk about Kentucky bluegrass today, and basically everything that we say regarding tall fescue will also apply to Kentucky bluegrass. So keep that in mind if you do have a Kentucky bluegrass yard. With you all being a little further north than me, I'm in Wichita, Kansas, we have very few Kentucky bluegrass lawns. And the further north you go, typically the more common that is of a turfgrass variety. But I want to take a second here and point out some of the other cool season lawn types. Sometimes you'll hear the word fine fescue, things like creeping red fescue, chewing fescue, hard fescue. All of those are just another word for fine fescue. Sometimes you'll hear words like annual bluegrass or annual ryegrass or perennial ryegrass. And while technically all of these are cool season grasses that could be grown as a lawn, typically we don't see or don't recommend these as turf types in our lawn because they're really not well adapted to our Kansas extremes. They really are going to struggle in the heat and the drought of the summer months. And so that's why we typically are going to recommend against fine fescue, annual bluegrass, annual ryegrass, or perennial ryegrass as a lawn grass. They will grow very well in the spring and the fall, but oftentimes these types of grasses will go completely brown no matter what you try to do to them in the summer months because they're just not well suited to the heat and the drought. Tall fescue is really going to be the most well adapted cool season grass that we're going to have in Kansas. And Kentucky bluegrass is better adapted than all these other options behind tall fescue. But typically, like I said, tall fescue is going to be one of our best adapted grasses. So that'll be where we really spend most of our time today. But the one thing I want to point out with that list of types of grasses is you don't want to be fooled into planting the wrong grass in your lawn. It's way too easy to get caught up in the fancy advertising of the grass seed that you can find at many of your stores. But if you don't know what you're planting, you really don't know how good of a success you're going to have. So the most important thing about picking the right variety and avoiding some of those poorly adapted varieties is to start with a high quality grass seed. I show you a few pictures here of 50-pound bags of grass seed, with my point being it's what's on the inside of those bags that's important, not what's on the outside. Some of our best high quality grass seed doesn't have flashy graphics or snazzy advertising, but what's inside that bag, that high quality grass seed, is really going to be what's important and makes the difference when it comes to the success you're going to have in your lawn. So the most important thing about fall lawn care and planting new grass is to start with a high quality grass seed, because not all grass seeds are going to be the same. When we talk about tall fescue, there are sort of subcategories of tall fescue that you can get into. One of the common types of tall fescue sometimes you'll hear people talk about is K31 tall fescue. And this is an old standby tall fescue. It's been around for many years. And really, this is a great tall fescue for low maintenance areas. Oftentimes you'll see these on kind of more rural properties where they want a tall fescue lawn, but they need something that's a little more heat tolerant, a little more drought tolerant. And so K31 is a great choice because it is a little bit lower maintenance when it comes to tall fescue. It does, however, have a little bit wider leaf blade and a coarser texture, so it doesn't necessarily make the best tall fescue for your home lawns. Often, if you're going to plant tall fescue nowadays, you want to look for newer cultivars that are classified as a turf type tall fescue. Basically, these are newer varieties of tall fescue that have better performance and create a better, higher quality lawn overall. Typically, they have narrower leaves to give you a finer texture. They have darker, more improved colors. And there's going to be lots of different varieties or different cultivars of these turf type tall fescues. The other great thing with all of these different varieties of turf type tall fescues is often when you go to purchase grass seed, you're going to look for things called tall fescue blends. And essentially that means that in that bag of grass seed, you're going to find 3 to 5, sometimes more, varieties of those turf type tall fescues all mixed together in that one bag. The great thing about tall fescue blends is typically these are going to be varieties that are shown to do well through some of our local K-State research that we do across the state. Often the industry uses some of those top performers to create their blends each year. And even though the exact ratio or the exact types of grass seeds, the varieties change from year to year, it's always usually a safer choice to go with those tall fescue blends. And what I'll show you is a picture of a label here to just kind of show you what that looks like. Here you're going to find a bag of grass seed, and all grass seeds have these labels somewhere on them. And here we have Avenger 2 tall fescue. We have Firecracker SLS tall fescue, Titanium SL tall fescue, Spider LS tall fescue, and Screamer tall fescue. I don't know who gets to name these tall fescue varieties, but what a job. They have quite the creative names under them. But the important thing here is we see at least 3 to 5 different tall fescue varieties all mixed together in this one bag of grass seed. And the real benefit here is that if one of these varieties struggles, maybe it struggles in the heat or maybe it struggles in the shade, there are 4 other varieties mixed in that same bag that will hopefully be able to handle those conditions better. So oftentimes with the tall fescue blends, one of these varieties may be more disease resistant. One of the varieties may have more insect resistance. One of them may have more shade resistance or tolerance. And so often by mixing these 3 to 5 different tall fescue varieties, you're going to find really improved performance. Because where one type of tall fescue struggles, hopefully another kicks in and fills in to still have that beautiful lawn. But in those bags of grass seed, and when you're looking at that label, there's other things we really want to pay attention to. And we really, really want to be mindful when purchasing grass seed to focus on weed seeds and other crops. Because like you see in this comic here, we can try and try and try to encourage some of our flowers or even the desirable types of tall fescue to grow. But we sprinkle those weed seeds in a crack in the driveway and those weed seeds are going to proliferate. So we want to make sure that when we're planting new grass seed, we're not planting weed seeds with it and giving those new dandelions or new weeds the opportunity to take over. So when you're looking at your tall fescue labels or the bags to look at the label on the bag, you want to make sure to look for 2 sections. One section is the weed seed, and then there's other crop. And typically these weed seeds and other crop sections tell us what other kind of things may be mixed into that bag of grass seed besides just the grass seed itself. Usually this is grasses like orchard grass or bluegrass. And the problem with these grasses is both are perennials. So you plant them once and these grasses come back year after year after year from the same rootstock. So once we plant them, there are very few options to control these other types of grasses or weed seeds, because oftentimes they cannot be selectively removed once they're already growing in your lawn. That other crop is often where you'll see some of those grass varieties listed. Could be things like orchard grass, bluegrass, but oftentimes they don't tell you. So I want to take a second here just to really focus in on the weeds or the grass seed labels and understanding how to read and interpret these grass seed labels. Every single bag of grass seed that you buy is going to have a seed label on the bag. It's required by law to tell you what is in that bag you're purchasing. Usually they're going to be up here on the top of the bag, or sometimes they'll be on the backside printed on the label itself. So here's just an example. This isn't anybody we're recommending or anything like that. This is just an example of what a bag of grass seed label might look like. And there's lots of things you're going to find on this label. You're going to find information about who produced this bag of grass seed. You're going to find what this grass seed is branded or sold under. But the important thing we want to really focus in on is this section here called components. This is going to tell us what types of grass seed are in the label. So here you see we have Reunion Tall Fescue, Compete Tall Fescue, and Stinson 2 Tall Fescue. This is ideally our Tall Fescue blend because there's 3 varieties of Tall Fescue mixed in. And the percent purity over here to the side tells us what ratio those 3 Tall Fescues are mixed together. So this one is about equal parts, 1/3 Reunion, 1/3 Compete, and 1/3 Stetson. The next thing you're going to see on the label is the percent germination. And essentially the percent germination just tells you of all the grass seeds in the bag that are this specific variety, how good are those seeds, or how many of those seeds will grow if you plant them under ideal conditions. Typically you want your percent germination above 85%, 90% is ideal. Typically you will never see a percent germination at 100%. So anything 90 to 95% is probably about as high as you're going to see, because in a 50-pound bag of grass seed, the manufacturer is not going to be able to guarantee that every single individual seed is going to be able to grow. And so typically, like I said, this 90% or so is going to be kind of a good indicator of a high quality grass seed that's going to grow. Each year you keep this grass seed in your garage or it sits on the store shelf, the lower that percent germination is going to become. But how you store that grass seed really makes a big difference in how good that percent germination stays. You'll also see other information here like the origin. Basically, this just means all of 3 of our grass seed varieties came from the state of Oregon. But beyond just the components of what we want in our grass seed, we also have to figure out what are those other things that are mixed into the grass seed that we may not want, but may be included. So here you can see right along the stitch, it says other crop seeds, and that's 0.00%. That is the ideal amount of other crops. Typically, we don't want any weed seeds or any grass seeds other than what we're ideally wanting to plant to be mixed into that bag. Again, with the weed seeds, you see 0.00%. That means there are no weed seeds in that bag. Oftentimes you'll see a line that says inert matter. And essentially what that means is it's just things that are either mixed into the bag or applied to the seed coat that help those seeds spread more easily when you put them in the spreader and keep them from getting basically all clumped together before you try to spread them. So again, just to go back to a different grass seed, this one says commodity, but it's the same thing. This is our 5 varieties of tall fescue, and that's ideally what we want to see, between 3 to 5 different tall fescue varieties all mixed together in that one bag of grass seed. Here, about all of these grass seed varieties are mixed in at about 20%. There's a little bit more Avenger and a little less Screamer, but again, they're all pretty well evenly mixed. Again, ideally we see 0% crop seed or other crop seed and 0% weed seed, which is ideal. And the reason I'm really making such a big deal out of this percent weed seed and this percent other crop is because it's not the number of seeds that are in the bag, it's the percentage of the overall weight of that bag that's made up by the weed seeds. The other really kind of sketchy thing, if you will, is the manufacturers are not specifically required to tell you what those weed seeds are or what those other crop seeds are unless it makes up 5% or more of the total weight of the bag. So you really have no idea what weed seeds or other crop seeds you could be getting. Sometimes it's things that are relatively harmless like annual ryegrass, but sometimes it's those perennial grasses like rough bluegrass or orchard grass that are going to come back year after year after year and continue to cause you problems. And so there really is no way of knowing what that other crop is or what that weed seed is unless there's 0.00% in it. And just to give you an example, here's an example of some tall fescue grass seed in somebody's hand. Most of you have probably seen or held the grass seed before and know it's very, very small. But our weed seeds are going to be even smaller. Here, for example, is to scale what a clover seed might look like in size comparison compared to your tall fescue seed. So if we think about how small those clover seeds are in compared to the size of the tall fescue, it is going to take far more clover seeds to equal the same amount of weight as your tall fescue seeds. So if we have, for example, 1 pound of tall fescue, that's going to be about 200,000 seeds of tall fescue. But if we have a 1 pound of white clover, those seeds are so much smaller. So 1 pound of white clover is more than 800,000 seeds. So you can see when we start to list these weed seeds and other crop seeds by weight, it really is not a good indication of the total number of weed seeds that are in that bag, because it only takes 1 pound of white clover to equal the same number of seeds that would be in 4 pounds of tall fescue seed. So a little bit of that weed seed or other crop really goes a long way into deteriorating the overall quality of your grass. So really, when you're looking for a good quality weed seed, if you can't, or grass seed, if you can't find one that has 0.0% weed seed and 0.00% other crop, you want to have no more than 0.01%. Because like I said, a little bit of weed seed and other crop goes a long ways into deteriorating the overall quality of the grass, because in just a little bit of weight, those weed seeds could actually outnumber the total number of grass seeds in the bag if you're not careful. Another good way to find these 0.00% weed seeds or 0.00% other crops is to make sure you're purchasing certified seeds. Typically, a certified seed is going to be the certification that there are no weed seeds or other crops mixed into that bag. And if you go to a lot of your larger box stores or grocery stores and you see grass seed, do not be fooled by the advertising. They may look like good options, but when you really start to get down and look at the label, there's going to be a lot less impressiveness in that label than it looks like on the advertising of the bag. So for example, all 3 of these bags, none of them have any tall fescue in them at all. There's 0 tall fescue seeds in any of these 3 bags. Even though it's branded as a Midwest mix or branded for sun and shade, there is no tall fescue. It's going to be these other cool season grasses, your fine fescues, your ryegrasses, and maybe your Kentucky bluegrasses that will grow in the spring and the fall, but they cannot tolerate the summer heat. So they will typically thin themselves out automatically through the process of the year because they can't tolerate those conditions. You'll also see the percent other crop and percent weed seed is very variable in these bags. The first one has pretty low amounts of weed seed, which is good. But this one on the far right here has 1% other crop. So there's a significant portion of other types of grasses mixed in that you have no idea what they are. Another one of those examples is this sun and shade mix. If you look very closely on the back of the bag where it tells you what they are, you'll see 3 types of fine fescue. You'll see some Kentucky bluegrass. You'll see some perennial ryegrass, but no tall fescue. So again, these are great options for people who live further north, but typically we need tall fescue in our grass seed mixes in order to survive some of the extremes of our Kansas summer, like our heats and our drought. Here on this one, it's a tall fescue blend. You saw this picture a minute ago. The good thing about this one is it does have 7 varieties of tall fescue, which is great. But part of the problem with this one is it also has 1.5% other crop. It tells you here that part of that other crop is ryegrass, but it doesn't specify whether that's an annual ryegrass or a perennial ryegrass that's going to come back year after year. That also leaves 0.10% mystery seed that you have no idea what it will be. So the important thing to keep in mind is even though there may be fancy advertising on these grasses or they may be cheaper in price, you pay for the quality that you get. And so we want really to focus on purchasing the higher quality grass seeds because those are the grasses that are going to have less problems all year long. Don't be planting the seeds of doubt when you purchase your grass seed. Make sure you spend a little extra money to purchase a grass seed that is going to be of a high quality. So beyond just picking the right grass seed, there are lots of insects and diseases that we may have to deal with in our grass seeds in our lawns throughout the year. Fall armyworm is one of those insects that has been extremely popular this year, been problematic across the state, and especially down here in South Central Kansas. The last 2 weeks, we've had hundreds of calls each week on these fall armyworm caterpillars. Basically, what this insect is, in case you haven't heard of it, is a tiny caterpillar that feeds on tall fescue lawns as well as other agronomic crops. The problem with this is it can really destroy and brown out an entire lawn, because often when you see fall armyworms, you don't see one, you see hundreds to thousands of them. And so they just feast across your lawn, eating all of the leaf blades, turning what leaf blades are left brown and moving on to the next lawn. Up further north, I know you guys have had some fall armyworm issues, not quite to the extent we have, but with fall armyworms, they're a problem every single year in Kansas. Usually they're in small populations, so it's not that big of a deal, but they do produce 2 to 4 generations per year. Usually those caterpillars that you saw are going to feed for 2 to 3 weeks, and they're going to produce a new generation of fall armyworm every 23 to 25 days. The good news is these caterpillars are a tropical moth, and so they migrate each winter back down from Central and South America, Texas and Florida. And so our freezes and frosts this winter will kill any fall armyworms that are remaining. But we are still likely to see potentially 1 more generation at least in Kansas of fall armyworms. So we want to make sure that you're watching out for these fall armyworms over the next month or 2. Because they will definitely prefer new grass seed if you're trying to plant or overseed a new lawn. They could be a problem yet this year. The other good news with fall armyworm, though, is typically they're going to feed on the blades of the grass, but they're not going to damage the crown or the growing point. So usually after 2 or 3 weeks, our lawns are able to recover from armyworm damage because typically they will not damage that crown, and so new growth is able to occur. If we water with some irrigation or we get some rainfall, that's going to help speed up that recovery. And this will be a good opportunity over the next couple of weeks if you do have fall armyworm damage to water, to see how your plants recover and see if additional planting is going to be needed, either overseeding or filling in some of the bare spots that might have showed up. Another big problem with tall fescue lawns is the brown patch disease. Brown patch can be very circular and kind of create these characteristic circles in your lawns, but sometimes brown patch is just this general browning throughout the whole lawn. One of the problems with brown patch is it develops during hot, humid weather. So our Kansas summers are typically always hot and humid, which really makes this disease a problem every year. Some years it's worse than others, just like the fall armyworms. And typically with brown patch, we're going to see this on tall fescue. From a distance, especially if you have this diffuse browning throughout the whole lawn, your grass is going to appear drought stressed. But typically, if you're watering it and that lawn is getting adequate water, you're more likely dealing with brown patch than you are other problems. Typically with brown patch, you don't want to look at the problem from a distance. You really want to get up close and inspect your lawn to be able to identify brown patch. Typically with brown patch, you're going to see these water-soaked lesions on the leaf blade. Typically, they are kind of this light tan color, and it looks like you set a wet cup on a piece of paper, and it just kind of, that ring of water just kind of works its way across the paper. Usually that water-soaked lesion is going to be bordered by this reddish-brown margin, which is also going to help you distinguish brown patch from other problems that you might see in the lawn. And like a lot of the problems we see with our lawn, brown patch not only is favored by the weather, but it's also favored by the maintenance practices we do to our lawn. Often with brown patch, in order to get good control, we want to try to find a tall fescue blend where some of those varieties are going to be less susceptible to the disease. And there's no tall fescue variety that's truly resistant, but by having a blend of at least a couple different tall fescue varieties, hopefully a few of those varieties will have a little bit more disease resistance. We also do not want to over fertilize. People are so eager each spring to go out and fertilize their lawn to get it to green up and to look good, but that is not the right way to do it. And by doing that, you actually increase the likelihood that you'll deal with brown patch that summer, because it's really favored by early spring and midsummer fertilizations. We also don't want to overwater our lawns, and we don't want to irrigate in the late afternoon or evening where our grass is going to stay wet for extended periods of time overnight. We can use fungicides to help suppress the disease, but it's really more about the weather and our cultural practices, how we maintain our lawn, that's going to have the biggest impact on brown patch control. And the last insect and disease I'll mention here is grubs, because often those are a problem every year. Typically, our grubs are going to be an insect larva of several different types of beetles. There's several different types of grubs out there, but they all live in the soil and they all feed on turf grass roots. With grub damage, typically you're going to see wilted grass, your lawn's maybe going to thin out, some areas may turn yellow or brown, and you'll likely see dead spots develop. Again, once you get the opportunity to get up close and start to investigate your lawn a little bit closer, when you pull up on that grass, you're going to see that grass really is going to lack a root system, and in heavy infestations of grub is going to roll up like a carpet would, because all of those roots are going to be fed off on the bottom. Typically, this time of year is when we start to see grub damage the most, in that late summer to fall time frame. So here's kind of that rolled up carpet effect with heavy grub feeding. And unfortunately, with grub control, there's no organic control options. We're going to have to use chemicals if grubs are a problem. But there are two different ways that we can go about treating for grubs. The first option is the preventative treatment, and we'll talk about that one first. So preventatively treating for grubs, we're typically using products that contain the active ingredient imidacloprid or the chlorothalonil. I didn't say that one right, and I apologize, but it's a tongue twister. If you use these two products, either of those two, typically these products would be applied from mid-June through early July. You can apply these earlier, even into the month of May, but the important thing is, again, these are preventative products, so they have to be put down before the grub feeding begins in the August timeframe. The nice thing about these products is they have a long period of control, and generally they're going to be safer for the environment and less damaging to non-target organisms that may be in the lawn. The disadvantage is typically, just like all good things, they cost a little bit more. But again, this is going to give you the longest period of control and probably be the safest grub control option for the environment. The alternative to that is what we call a rescue treatment, and that's your second option for grub control. Typically, your rescue treatments are products you put down when the grubs are causing damage. So typically, you're going to apply those in the last few weeks of July or the first few weeks of August, right as those grubs are hatching and small and starting to do damage in the lawn. Typically, you're going to look for products that contain dialox, because that is going to be our best rescue treatment for grub control. Either the preventative option or the rescue option are going to be effective, but it's critical that you apply the right product at the right time, because if you switch the times that you would apply either of these products, you will not have success in controlling those grubs and will still see damage. And this leads us to the next topic: having all the right stuff, doing all the right things, but doing them in the wrong time of year. And I think that's probably where most people run into problems with their lawn care, is doing the right things just at the wrong time. And so I'm here to say September is the month for doing cool season lawn care. So for our tall fescue, September is the ideal month to plant, to overseed, to fertilize, to core aerate, and to think about weed control. All of those things that we do over this next month will really set up our lawn for success all year long. And so why September? Why is so magical or important about the months of September? And just like this comic points out, it's all about timing. September for planting is extremely important because all summer long, the sun beats down on the soil, heats up our soil, and the soils are warm when we get to September. This is going to encourage any seeds that we put down to germinate and to grow very quickly with those warm soils. We also have warm days and cool nights as we get into the fall. So that gives the seedlings plenty of time to grow vigorously, but it gives them a break in the evening hours so that there's less environmental stress on our tall fescue seedlings. We also have far less weed competition in the fall than we do in the summer or the spring. And so oftentimes people will try to plant grass seed in the spring, but weeds will take advantage of that more than the grass will be able to. So by planting now, we're typically going to have less weed competition as well. With tall fescue seedlings and planting grass seed for tall fescue, we can do it anytime between late August and October 15th. Typically, if we look at late August, we're going to get the fastest germination. You're going to put down that grass seed, and 3 to 4, maybe 5 days later, you're already going to see that grass up and growing. The problem with late August is more water is going to be required in order to maintain that grass because those seedlings cannot dry out once you plant them. Typically mid-September is what we recommend in general for tall fescue seeding because you're still going to get that quick germination, but it's going to be less critical to have water there because it's going to be cooler. We're typically getting a little bit more rainfall, and so less supplemental water or irrigation is required by mid-September. And at the very least, we encourage you to plant tall fescue by October 15th. And the big thing about that is we just need to give that tall fescue some time in order to grow and establish before it starts to go dormant or growth slows in the winter months. Again, no matter when you plant in the fall, you want to make sure that you're not using any pre-emergent chemicals for weed control that might also influence this grass seed's ability to grow. I've used the term overseeding several times today, so I want to make sure that we clarify what that is and how overseeding is different than planting a new lawn. So typically, if we're starting over or planting a new lawn, the scenario is we need to start with bare soil. Typically, there's going to be no existing grass that we're working with. And oftentimes people will do this in a new home or lawns that have more weeds than it does desirable grass. If we're starting over and planting a new lawn, typically we're going to apply about 6 to 8 pounds of tall fescue grass seed per 1,000 square feet. On the other hand, if we're overseeding, we already have a somewhat established lawn. Typically, these lawns are going to have bare spots. Maybe the fall armyworms, for example, created some bare spots in that soil. So those lawns are going to need thickened up and filled back in, but we're already starting with some existing grass. So when we're overseeding, we're doing all of the same things. We're just using half the amount of grass seed. So typically, if you're overseeding, you're using 3 to 4 pounds of tall fescue grass seed per 1,000 square feet. And that's because we're calculating for the existing lawn that's already there and growing. So if your lawn looks like this at the end of the summer, and there's a lot of lawns that always look like this because of the Kansas environment, don't give up. You've made it through the summer, and now's the time to take action, because the summer heat, the droughts, the winds, all of that takes its toll on everything in the garden in Kansas. And so now is the time to consider overseeding in grasses or lawns that look like this. And really, like I said, overseeding, what we're really trying to do is fill in the bare spots and thicken up the overall denseness of the lawn so that it looks green and lush all the way across. And because we have existing turf, we're accounting for that and only using half the recommended grass seed rate, so we don't cause too much competition among the grass itself. Oftentimes people put down way too much grass seed, and the problem with that is the grass outcompetes itself, it weakens itself, it fights for water, fights for nutrients, and you're more likely to deal with insect or disease problems later on because it's weakened from fighting itself in overcrowded situations. If you are going to plant new grass seed, or you are going to try to do overseeding this fall, we do typically encourage you to consider having a soil test done. You can do that through your local extension office. And the way I look at a soil test is this is detecting the invisible problems in the soil. You can't look at the soil and know that it's lacking in phosphorus or needs more potassium. You really have to know what your soil nutrient levels are through a soil test. But I would encourage you to plan ahead, because oftentimes it takes a couple weeks for that soil test to happen, the results to get interpreted, and then a report with fertilizer recommendations be sent back to you. Another important thing about planting lawns this fall is we really want to have good soil to seed contact. Ideally, we don't want to just put those grass seeds on the surface. We want to try to get them 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch deep in the soil. We do not want to plant our grass seeds deeper than that because they will not grow well. Typically, we can use all kinds of different machinery to do that. There's products that you can rent or machines that you can rent called slit seeders, verticutters, core aerators. You could rototill the area or just use the good old garden rake to loosen the soil surface and increase that soil to seed contact. Basically, the more soil contact you have with the seed, the more water is going to be able to be held up against the seed, which is going to help you be successful in maintaining that new grass as it tries to get established. We also, with grass seed, want to try to make a couple applications or passes across the lawn when we're applying that grass seed. So we talked about in a brand new bare soil environment, we want to put down 6 to 8 pounds of tall fescue per 1,000 square feet. So ideally, what we'd recommend is taking half of that amount, this 2 to 3 pounds, putting it in the spreader and going north and south across the lawn. Then we take the remaining 2 to 3 pounds of tall fescue grass seed, put it back in the spreader and go east and west across the lawn. And basically by making these passes in 2 different directions, we're making sure that we don't skip any parts of the lawn where we are too far apart between our passes and our spreader doesn't get grass seed in those areas. So by doing this, we're going to be spreading the grass seed much more evenly and have a lot more consistent lawn come up as a result. Next thing we really need to focus on after our grass seed is planted and really all year long is the proper watering, because often improper watering is, again, one of the big problems that we see in our lawns. With tall fescue and any kind of grass seed you're planting, typically we want to make sure that we're watering frequently at first because that grass seed has to stay wet in order to germinate. And once those little grass seeds are starting to grow, they cannot dry out once they've started to germinate, otherwise they die. We want to make sure that we, in addition to watering frequently, we're watering gently so as not to wash that grass seed away. And right after we plant that grass seed for the first time, we really want to soak the ground at least 2 to 3 inches deep so there's plenty of groundwater available as those seeds start to grow. This is a great example of what not to do. Typically with our tall fescue seedlings, typically we're going to water frequently and lightly. So during the hot days, we may need to water 2 to 3 times a day in order to keep that soil surface moist right where the grass seed is. Later on in September and early October, it may be cool, it may be overcast, and we may be able to keep that ground or the soil surface moist without watering every day. Sometimes we can even get a couple days between watering. But we want to make sure that we keep that soil surface moist when we're trying to get new grass established, but not waterlogged like you see here. And this is where people stop when they think about tall fescue watering. But really, as tall fescue grows, we need to switch from frequent light irrigations back to deep and infrequent waterings. So typically our tall fescue lawns in the heat of the summer are going to need about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week. Ideally, we want to put that amount down over the course of the week in 1 watering, 2 waterings, or maybe 3 waterings at the most. We want to make sure there's time for the ground to dry out in between waterings, especially for those tall fescue lawns that are already established, because this is going to increase the root depth that we're going to see. And the deeper the roots go, the better our grass is going to grow all summer long. We can also wait to see when our lawns tell us they need watered. If you walk across the lawn and see footprints that are left behind, often that's an indication that more water is needed in the lawn because there's not enough water in the grass seed to spring that plant back up or for it to be what's called turgid. We also want to make sure that we're not causing problems through incorrect fertilization. Ideally, we want our tall fescue lawns to go from this to this with great green growth. And maybe we don't want to get quite that excessive with the growth, but what we do want to do is we do want to fertilize in September and in the fall, because this is really going to encourage healthy root development, which is going to then sustain the plant all summer long. That's also going to help us increase the overall denseness of the turf. And it's also going to help us reduce winter damage by building food reserves up in the plant. The other hint about fall fertilization is also what helps our lawn green up earlier the following spring. So if you fertilize only once per year, really do it in September. Ideally, we want 1/2 pound to 1.5 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, and it can be either a slow release or quick release nitrogen. If you fertilize again in the fall, November is the second most critical month of the year. This application is, again, really what helps that grass green up earlier next spring, and you will see that difference if you fertilize in November as well as September. Tall fescue could be fertilized in the spring up to 3 times a year, September, November, and May. But if you fertilize in the spring, do not do it in the first part of the spring. Wait until May and make sure you're using a slow release nitrogen fertilizer. That just means a little bit of nitrogen is released from the pellet over time. And so that's going to help keep the lawn green if you're watering all summer long without causing a lot of disease problems. I know there was a lot of technical terms in that last slide, but all fertilizers are essentially going to be labeled with 3 numbers. Here in this example, it's a 1600. The percent nitrogen is that first number on the bag, so that's typically what you're going to want to look for. And when you're trying to determine how much fertilizer to use, don't panic over the math. Read and follow the label instructions on the package. And if you have questions, refer to our lawn fertilizing guide publication. I love this publication because on the second page, it gives you this chart that tells you based on the overall percentage of nitrogen across the top that we'll find in our fertilizer we're going to use, and based on the total square footage of our lawn, how much lawn we're applying our fertilizer to, you find where those 2 numbers meet, and that tells you exactly how many pounds of fertilizer to buy. So if I have a 2300 fertilizer, and that's 23% nitrogen, and I've got a 10,000 square foot lawn, I will need 43 pounds of fertilizer in order to get the appropriate amount down for my November or September fertilization. You always, though, want to make sure that you take special care to sweep up your sidewalks, driveways, or curbs, and we're not allowing that fertilizer or other products to get washed down to our drains and then back into our community ponds, rivers, and streams. It's extremely important that we take responsibility for that last step and pull out the leaf blower, pull out the broom, whatever it's going to take. It's an easy step. One of the last things I want to wrap up today with is weed problems, and September is a great time to address those too. I'm not going to get into what is a weed, what isn't a weed. Technically, a weed is any plant out of place. So that could be the petunia in the sidewalk crack, the dandelion in your lawn, or the red tulip in a field of yellow tulips. It doesn't matter. Weeds are what you make them. So whatever you've defined as a weed, whatever you don't want growing in your lawn, those are going to be what we'll talk about controlling here. The best way, though, to prevent weeds is to do the things that we've already talked about. Plant competition. A healthy turf grass is going to outcompete and outgrow a lot of our weeds if we're doing it correctly. If we still have weeds that show up, though, typically we want to make sure that we distinguish whether or not we've recently planted grass seed or we're just working with our established lawns. Typically, our newly planted lawns need at least 4 weeks before a lot of our weed control products are going to be safe to apply. Make sure you read and follow the labels. But in general, most of our newly planted lawns need mowed at least 2 to 3 times before they're safe on some of our selective herbicides that would control the weed and be safe on the grass. Not all chemicals are safe on all types of grass. So again, it's extremely important that you read the product label of whatever weed control product you may purchase. Really, again, with weed control, there's 2 options in the fall. The first is a preventative weed control approach, and that's applying things in early to mid-September to control weeds like henbit and chickweed. If we have other weeds like little barley, some of those need to be applied by late August because all of these preventative products essentially prevent the weed seeds from growing. So they have to be applied before the weed seeds start to grow. The important thing to note, you see it here in red, any of these pre-emergent products are going to also stop grass seeds from growing as well. The products can't distinguish between a grass seed and a weed seed, they just stop all seeds. And so you want to make sure that you don't apply any pre-emergent product if you're planning to overseed or plant new grass. Typically, Barricade or Dimension, the prodiamine or dithiopyr, typically these are going to give us long season applications, so we can put one application down and really have control of henbit and chickweed all winter long. But if we miss those timings and we start to see some of this henbits popping up or other weeds that we need to establish control over, typically our selective weed control is going to be our second option. Typically, we're going to use combination products, things that usually contain 2,4-D, MCPP, and dicamba. That's going to kill a lot of our broadleaf weeds, henbits, chickweeds, other things like that, dandelions, whatever the case may be. Usually these products are going to be best applied in the late October to early November timeframe. And that's because often during this part of the year, they're sending their energy back down to the roots. And so we're more successful at killing the root in all of these plants rather than just burning off the leaves on the surface. Again, carefully follow and read any label instructions on those products because your newly planted lawns could still be sensitive even against some of these products that would be considered safe to apply to tall fescue. And the very last thing before we get to questions today is we also need to address environmental extremes. And there's always heat, there's always drought, and we've sort of addressed a lot of those already today. But one of the things we haven't addressed environmentally is shade and tree competition. This is really one of the places where a lot of people also struggle with their lawn success. And that's because our big, strong trees oftentimes are just outcompeting our grasses in those areas. Again, we want to make sure that we have the right type of grass growing underneath those underneath those trees. Typically, our fine fescue is going to be the most shade tolerant grass, but again, it's not well suited to our area. If you lived in Nebraska and further north, it's a great option. So really our best option for lawn grasses underneath trees and in deep shade are going to be tall fescue. Kentucky bluegrass is our next option, and all of these listed here in blue are going to be our cool season grasses. We can have success with warm season grasses in the shade, but typically it needs to be zoysia grass. That's going to be the most shade tolerant type of lawn grass that you'll find growing in the shade. But really all of our warm season lawns are going to struggle in the shade and not have as good a growth as tall fescue will. But just because it will have good growth doesn't mean it's easy to do. So if you have a really dense shade or large trees on your property, you may want to consider having those trees pruned in order to increase some of the light penetration that gets through the canopy. In the fall, you want to make sure you remove fallen leaves so the grass doesn't get smothered out by the thick layer of leaves on top. It's really important to water correctly and make sure you're watering deeply and infrequently when you're watering in shaded areas. You really need to encourage that root system to be deep so that it can handle dry spells during the year. Do not over fertilize tall fescue in the shade. Use a little bit less and you'll have better results. We mentioned a second ago, selecting shade tolerant grasses. Stick to tall fescue in the shade. That's where you're going to have the most success. You may also want to apply less grass seed in those areas as well, because if you have too much grass seed, not only is that grass competing with the tree, that grass is also going to be competing with other grass plants growing in the area. Increase your mowing height up a little bit, go 3 to 4 inches tall in order to increase your success in the shade, and really try to limit traffic and really soggy, wet soil conditions. That can really damage our shade grasses as well. And just like we mentioned earlier, do not water in the late afternoons or evenings. That's more likely to lead to disease because our tall fescue is not going to dry out and is going to stay wet all night. So I have thrown a lot of information out at you today, and I do want to take a few minutes to answer some questions and see what kind of things you guys have that we can help you with on being successful with your lawns this fall.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. We do have a few questions, at least one that's come in so far on the chat from Kevin. Let me go back up to that. So we were talking about soil testing, and I know we're focusing on our fall lawn care, but do you recommend a spring soil test to see about fertilization at that time?
So typically your soil test is going to give you results that are pretty consistent for a 2 to 3 year period at least. So I think the biggest thing is do not take a soil test right after you fertilized, because that could skew your results. But I think anytime you soil test your lawn during the course of the year, you're going to get fairly consistent results. It may be a little higher or a little lower, but not statistically different. That's going to cause significantly different recommendations. But what people do sometimes make the mistake of is they'll apply fertilizer and 2 or 3 weeks later take a soil test, and the soil test gets a lot of that fertilizer out of that as well. And so you really don't have a good recommendation. So I would probably test midsummer, give yourself a month or two to get the soil tests in, the results back, give you time to buy the products and still apply them in the September timeframe.
That's great. And Leslie just put a link in the chat for our soil testing part of our website. And it's different county to county, but Matt was spot on here in Shawnee County. It does take about 2 to 3 weeks to get that back. So yeah, maybe planning ahead and getting it done a little early before your fall lawn care. So I actually had a question when you were talking about getting that good seed to soil contact when you're seeding or you're reseeding using the core aerator and the slit seeder, I think you said, and a couple other things.
Yep.
The struggle for us, and probably still for you guys too in Sedgwick County, is the clay. So do you have a preferred tool to use to kind of break up, you don't want to work it wet, but to break up those aggregates to get that good contact without having chunks of soil?
And that's a great question. And any of those machines will help you do that. I like the slit seeder because it's easy. It's got solid blades underneath that will break up that soil surface. And the nice thing about the slit seeder is it also has a hopper on top that you dump the grass seed into, and it breaks up the soil surface, applies the grass seed, and kind of covers the seed up after it's done. So it sort of does it all in one. I'm cheap though. I'll just take the good old garden rake or shovel and just sort of break up that soil surface before you apply your grass seed. And kind of mix it in and then water it in. That kind of helps resettle that clay, but hopefully gets that grass seed a little bit underneath, at least partially coated by the clay.
That's great. So it looks like Kevin clarified his question a little bit. Will a fall soil test let you know if you need to fertilize again in the spring? He specifically had problems with excess nitrogen in his turf grass.
Gotcha. So typically you do not need to fertilize in the spring. If you are going to fertilize, you really want to focus on September. And if you fertilize twice, do it in November. The spring's fertilization is really just in a high quality lawn to help keep it green all summer long. And so I think the important thing is you really don't need that fertilization. So I would really focus on the fall fertilizations. Just so you're applying what you need then, because that's what's really going to make the most difference in your lawn. The spring fertilization is sort of a bonus that might help the grass, but not really the one to be concerned about.
Awesome. And Sheila had a question. Is there ever a point where you should remove thatch from your lawn?
Yes, thatch can be a problem, and thatch is essentially a buildup of either plant roots or plant stems. And usually thatch is more of a problem in Bermuda grass and zoysia grass and those grasses where they kind of spread by underground rhizomes or runners. But it can be a problem in tall fescue. There is a certain point where you should remove thatch, and I think we have a great publication on it. I think it's about in the inch to inch and a half range. I believe there's a number in there that if your thatched layer is thicker than that, we would recommend either verticutting or core aerating to cut down on that thatch. The other misnomer with thatch is when you mulch your mowing clippings back into the ground, that does not contribute to your thatch layer. Typically, those are going to be a softer part of the plant, so they dehydrate and disintegrate more quickly and actually are going to add more nutrients and health back to your soil.
Awesome. And we hear that a lot too with the grass clippings. It's a super common misconception. So I actually had another question because you guys are a little bit ahead of us with the fall armyworms.
Yeah.
We got them, but I think at least a week after you guys started to see them. Are you starting to see turf grass recover from that feeding, or is it looking a little more grim?
I think a lot of our turf grasses in this area are recovering. It's still early because last week we were still in the heavy feeding time frame. This week is kind of our first break in a lot of areas from seeing fall armyworm action or feeding going on. So we are seeing a lot of recovery because, again, the crown of the plant, the part where all the growth comes from, is undamaged. So I think on that regards, a lot of people are going to see a lot of recovery in their lawn, but a lot of people are also going to probably have patchiness, some bare spots where the feeding was a little bit more intense. And so there'll still be places where they need to overseed, but it's probably not to the extent of having to reseed the entire lawn.
Yeah, I know that feeding was very, very dramatic at first. And so we did have a lot of those concerns, as I'm sure you guys did too.
Yes, for sure.
Okay, well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So thank you, Matt, so much for joining us.
Oh, sorry. There was.
Did you have one, Leslie?
There was one more from Kevin. He was asking, do you have recommendations for shade alternatives to traditional turf grass? Sorry about that.
Oh, you're good.
Absolutely. Some of the best things you can do for the shade is increase the size of your mulch rings around your tree. That right up against the trunk of the tree is going to be one of the hardest areas to grow some of those turf grasses. So don't even bother. Just apply some mulch and enjoy the beauty of that. Ground covers can also be a great alternative in those areas as well. There's a lot of different ground covers that will do very well here in Kansas. And again, be able to compete a lot better with the tree than some of those turf varieties will.
And Matt, just to remind me, you recommend really piling that mulch up like a volcano around your trees, right?
I don't think I've ever said that.
Oh, I must have you confused.
Yeah, you must be thinking of another Matt, because mulching is always like a donut. You typically want circular in shape with that hole in the center. Typically, we want that mulch pulled back 3 to 6 inches away from the trunk. And just like any good donut, ideally 2 to 3 inches thick. And just like every donut out there, there's 1,001 flavors you can choose from, just like there's all kinds of mulches that'll work. So pick what looks best in your opinion, because there's not a right or wrong answer. Ideally, we just recommend something that's a plant-based product, either leaves, mulch, wood chips, something organic that will eventually break down over time and contribute to the soil health versus maybe rocks or inorganic plastic mulches.
And Matt has a great program on mulching trees. So that's why I had to give him a hard time. But I do think it's a little bit funny that in that program, you talk about mulching like a donut. And at the beginning of this program, you talked about seeds that were donut seeds. So I'm starting to see a theme.
I'm not a complicated person. I'm sorry.
That's great. Well, thank you, Matt, so much. And thank you all for joining us. I think we'll be able to send out the recording yet today, but if not, you'll see it tomorrow. And please take just a minute to fill out that survey. It really does help us get good feedback so we know what we're doing right. So thank you all for joining, and thanks so much, Matt, for being our guest speaker today.
Absolutely. Thank you.